Throughout the Cold War, the Soviet Union was an absolute giant of arms production. Whether it was the jungles of Vietnam, the sands of Egypt, or the skies over India, Soviet designed and manufactured weapons were absolutely everywhere. And when the Union fell, Russia did everything it could to capture that tradition and reputation. It retained a position as the world's second largest arms supplier, following only the United States. At their Army 2020 Arms Expo, Russian leaders stood up surrounded by the finest that Russian engineering could provide. Putin would proudly go so far as to declare that Russia's weapons are in many cases, quote, decades ahead of their Western counterparts. It was a bit of a flashy show all round, with star appearances by the Sukhoi 57 and 75, and a claim by Vladimir Putin that Russia was still there to provide the very best weapons to its friends and allies around the world. As he was talking though, Ukraine was planning a very different expo of Russian arms. In the lead up to Ukrainian Independence Day, the destroyed husks of Russian armoured vehicles were laid out on the streets of Kyiv. These blasted and burnt out metal husks were meant to send a message that Russia would never get the victory parade in Kyiv that it had wanted. But more than just a message of defiance, it was an open, public question as to the quality of Russian arms products. Another open challenge perhaps to the narrative of the superiority of Russian armaments. And the question I want to ask today is, what do incidents like this and 6 months of intense losses and military struggle in Ukraine mean for the once invulnerable Russian armaments sector? After turret-tossing tanks and return-to-sender anti-aircraft missiles, is anyone still going to buy Russian? Okay, so what am I going to be covering today? First, I'm going to give a little bit of history. This is going to be on Soviet and Russian arms exports, how they've developed over time. Then I'm going to give a brief introduction to the global arms trade, not in any significant detail because I do want to do a dedicated video on that topic, looking at the top providers. Today I want to focus on Russia, but I need to do a little bit of an introduction to make sense here. I'm going to look at Russia's key export products, where its competitive advantages lie, and also who its main buyers are. I'm going to capture some recent trends to make sure we don't over-attribute changes to the Ukraine war, and then I'm going to look at the impacts of the war. And then finally, I will include some projections for the Russian armament sector and Russian arms exports going forward. Again, as a caveat, I'm focusing on Russia today. Expect another video on the top 10 arms trading countries coming down the line soon. It was the most requested topic in a recent poll, and I'd hate to disappoint. Alright, a little bit of history first. You can't really talk about the Russian armament sector without talking about the Soviets first. The Soviet Union emerged from World War II as an absolute leader in the armaments industry, and it only built on that strength as the Cold War went on. And when your country sucks at producing consumer goods but pumps out assault rifles by the millions, it's perhaps not surprising that the Soviets made arms exports a critical part of their international diplomacy. If you would admit to having at least one positive thought about communism at some point during your life, odds are the Soviet Union would be at your door the next day offering to sell you AKs, RPGs, and T-55s. You can see on the chart there in the top right that in many years during the Cold War, Soviet arms exports actually exceeded in terms of value those of the United States. You'll be seeing a lot of these graphs during this presentation, by the way, and they're measured in what's called trend indicator value. This is basically an index developed by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute that's designed to be able to measure the value of arms exports over time, meaning that we can actually at least try to compare like with like. During the late Cold War, arms exports actually became a critical mechanism for preserving the Soviet Union's trade balance. Tanks, assault weapons, aircraft would go overseas, and vital industrial inputs and consumer goods would come back in return. During the Cold War, Soviet equipment was generally regarded as rugged, affordable, and particularly early on didn't suffer from much of a technological gap when compared to NATO countries. It's often claimed that Albert Einstein once said that he didn't know what weapons World War III would be fought with, but World War IV would be fought with sticks and stones. Now, I'm no Einstein, but I would respectfully disagree, because even after an atomic war, I refuse to believe that whatever humans survived wouldn't be able to find at least a few thousand examples of AK-47s and T-55 tanks that weren't still in workable condition in the nuclear wasteland. Soviet kit was pretty rugged. Of course, come the 1990s, the Soviet Union was gone, and with it, the economy and industrial heft of the old Soviet Union. The Soviet armament sector had been sustained both by extremely large and generous government demand for its weapons, and also a close industrial integration between factories and production in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the other Soviet republics. Come 1992, well, there was no Soviet defense budget anymore, and Ukraine and Belarus were foreign countries as far as the Russian armaments industry were concerned. Production and legal exports went through the floor. Aviation production hit embarrassingly low levels, and arms dealers and their oligarch and organised crime contacts did everything they could to relieve the Soviet stockpiles of as many weapons as possible in order to ship them to various brushfire conflicts around the world. Order would slowly be restored, but come 2000, Russian arms exports were less than a third in TIV terms than the Soviet exports were in the year 1980, and that's despite the significant economic growth experienced by the world in the meantime. The solution the Kremlin came to in the 2000s was an aggressive consolidation of the Russian armament sector. In 2000, they formed Rosoboronexport as the one-stop shop, at least by 2008, the one-stop shop for all Russian armaments exports. If you were a foreigner looking to buy Russian weapons, you didn't talk to the individual manufacturer anymore, you came through the one front door. Meanwhile, the aviation sector, which had been split up into various companies representing the old design bureaus, was aggressively consolidated as well. The United Aircraft Corporation was founded in 2006, and another company, both under the control of the government, Rostec, was formed in 2007. And again, I say company here, but these are state-controlled entities. And these organisations immediately set about, well, getting bigger. Rostec started absorbing bankrupt or in distress assets across the Russian military-industrial complex, picking up companies by the literal dozens. UAC would eventually be true to its name by picking up the Sukhoi and Mikoyan companies, gaining a monopoly over fixed-wing aviation in Russia. Rostec, meanwhile, had bought pretty much all the helicopter manufacturers and a bunch of other companies, and then in turn gained control over UAC. The result was that Rostec became a state-controlled giant. Dozens of holding companies, hundreds of enterprises, hundreds of thousands of employees in one organisation that basically stood astride the entire Russian military-industrial complex. In theory, costs could be brought down and production could be pushed up as resources were more efficiently utilised, but any semblance of internal competition was now gone. Now, the Soviet Union may have been gone, but I like to imagine the old defence sector apparatchiks would have been perfectly at home with the idea of one large state-controlled enterprise sitting on top of the entire sprawling Russian military-industrial complex. But hey, for a while at least, costs seemed to be coming down, production volumes were going up. What could possibly go wrong? And before I try and answer that foreboding question, I thought it was important to give a quick introduction to some aspects of the legal arms trade. In order to be competitive and work out how competitive a country is in the arms sector, there are two main components to consider. What sort of products do they produce, and do they have a competitive advantage in any of them? Do they make any world beaters? It could be America with its advantage in the aviation sector, or it could be Russians when it comes to air defense. The key is, do you have a product with the right performance characteristics and cost that it's going to be attractive to other people when it comes to buying? The second component is purchases and politics, because the who and why of what countries buy goes well beyond just how much a system costs and how effective it is. Buying major weapon systems from a country is kind of like getting into a long-term relationship. You develop a sort of reliance. After all, you're signing up to basically say that a country is going to have power over you because they control your supply of technology, spare parts, or replacements. When you go to upgrade in the future, well, it's going to be easier to upgrade with them again than switch over to an entirely new system. And as a result, politics plays a pretty heavy role in armament selection. Now, you could argue there's also a side issue here of subsidies and support. That is, how much do governments provide in terms of support to their own armament sectors in order to make them more competitive? I'd argue that's really just a part of the price aspect of the product offering. If a country is willing to massively subsidise exports in order to make them appear cheaper, well then as far as the rest of the world is concerned, well, their exports are just cheap. So if you want an example of a country that might be considered to have a product advantage, one you might want to look at is Germans and diesel engines. And the numbers here are so stark that I sometimes wonder if Germans get like a +10 to diesel engineering and character creation, or whether they're handing out books on how to build maritime diesels to people in creche, who knows. The point is, when I ripped the arms register of every major German arms sale for the last couple of years and categorised every single entry as either a diesel engine or literally everything else, about a third of the entries were diesel engines. Not in terms of value, but in terms of quantity on entries. Chinese Type 39G submarines? German engines. So if you're wondering why they're so quiet, thank Berlin. French APCs going to Gabon, that'll be German engines. Italian frigates for the UAE, again, German engines. Russian-built missile boats going to Vietnam, well, once again, that will be a German MTU 8000 engine. Now, I will insert a caveat here before any Brits in the chat get angry with me. The company which manufactures many of these engines, the company that was once Maybach, it is owned by Rolls-Royce, so the Brits may choose to take credit, but the engineering, the design work, a lot of the manufacturing is all done in Germany. So what you've got here is a product or a series of products with performance characteristics that's supported by a specific industrial advantage such that basically everyone who can afford it wants to buy a particular sort of engine for certain uses. So what we can all take from this is Germany may at times hesitate to sell countries weapons, but it won't hesitate to sell people engines to make sure that the weapons they buy from other people get to where they need to be on time and reliably. And hey, buying good engines is important, otherwise you end up as the Russian carrier, the Kuznetsov, which doesn't leave port without a tugboat because it breaks down so damn often. The second element are political considerations, not just about the product, it's about the countries involved. Now here Pakistan is a good example. In 2004, China was a relatively minor arms supplier to Pakistan. By 2020, it was dominant by far. Now this wasn't just because China had suddenly developed the world's best weapons. It was in the context of changing US-Pakistani relations, Russia and France dialing up their support to India, and determined efforts by the Chinese to break into the Pakistani market. Pakistan has made the choice that it does not want to be dependent on the US for arms supplies, and ditto with Russia. So at this point, it might be the case that even if, say, Lockheed Martin were to develop the perfect weapon systems for Pakistan, it might lose out to a competitor for China, because at this point the defense relationship is solidly in place. So there are your two main factors to consider: the quality and the competitiveness of the product, and the politics that sits around it. So with that quick discussion had, let's talk about Russian products and Russian purchases. Because before you assess what's going to happen to the Russian armament sector, it probably helps to understand what they were selling up until this point. Now, Russia is a full-spectrum arms provider. They sell everything from bullets and assault rifles to cruise missiles and aircraft. And while the country may be famous for things like its tanks, between 2001 and 2021, almost half of Russian arms exports by value, so about $61 billion in trend indicator value, was actually made up by aircraft sales, helicopters and fixed wing. The second largest category were missiles, followed by armoured vehicles, and then ships and air defence systems. There were also a fair number of engines being sold, presumably with Germany and America hissing in the background, depending on whether it was an aircraft engine or a diesel engine, respectively. But in some ways, we shouldn't be surprised that aircraft were the largest single export category. After all, aircraft absolutely dominate the total arms trade in general in terms of value. So it's also helpful to understand which categories Russia dominates in, even if they don't have the raw dollar value of the aircraft category. Because as I said, different nations have different products in different areas of natural competitive advantage. For Russia, it's air defense systems, where almost half of the world's air defense exports between 2001 and 2021 came from the Russian Federation. Now that graph on the right breaks things up by 10 of the largest arms exporters. I've coloured all the EU nations in the same shade of blue. America is the darkest blue and the UK is light blue because, let's be honest, they're all mostly on the same team. And what you can see is that Russia outperforms all of them when it comes to air defense systems, and it has a respectable share when it comes to things like aircraft, armoured vehicles, engines, and missiles. It used to be a much larger player in the shipmaking game, but right now it's the European Union countries that are dominating weaponized ship sales. And in part, that's because Russia no longer has access to imports from Ukraine and Europe in order to fuel its military shipbuilding sector. But what this does show is that even though aircraft is by far Russia's strongest area in terms of revenue, their global market position isn't as strong than it is in something like air defense. In any case, it is worth looking at some of these categories in detail. What are they selling that's so popular? Russia is a full-spectrum provider in the air defense market. It has an advantage in that it is able to sell you a fully integrated air defense system and IADS, with systems ranging from short-range defenses like Pantsir all the way out to vaguely strategic level air defense systems like S-400. Russia inherited the USSR's focus on ground-based air defense systems. The Soviets favoured SAMs for a number of reasons. They were solidly outmatched by NATO in the air, and also when you put a system on the ground, it doesn't matter if you're slightly behind in terms of computing technology, because things like weight are nowhere near as important when you're on the ground as if you're in an aircraft. But with that industrial and design tradition behind them, Russia has been able to produce some very high standard systems, at least in terms of their on-paper technical specifications. S-400 is so capable that it's actually been able to penetrate into some what you would think is ostensibly NATO or NATO-adjacent markets. Notably, Turkey would go on to buy the things, even though it meant being thrown out of the F-35 program. I'll link a video in the description by another Australian YouTuber who went into the Russian air defense system in some greater detail, but the essence is this: Russia produces and sells a number of systems in the air defense space that are nominally cost-effective, but also have no direct Western performance equivalents. It is hard to find Western systems that do everything that S-400 does, and for that reason we perhaps shouldn't be surprised of Russia's great presence in the air defense market. If you want to reach out and touch an incoming aircraft at 400 kilometers from the launch site, there really is no substitute. In terms of fixed and rotary winged aviation, there's a couple of advantages that Russia has always marketed based on. The first is lower cost compared to Western platforms. Sukhois are going to be cheaper than things like Rafale or F-15. Most of these aircraft have rugged airfield capabilities that are really only matched by things like Gripen, not by most Western aircraft. And in terms of weapons integration options, the Russians do have a decent range of weapon systems available for export that bolt readily onto their Sukhoi and Mikoyan platforms. And then when it comes to helicopters, the Mi-8 is the AK-47 of utility helicopters. It's a box that flies, and every military in the world has a requirement for a giant box that flies. You can buy Mi-8s or the improved Mi-17 for a fraction of the cost of something like a Black Hawk. In addition, Russia's able to realise a certain cost advantage. You see, they've got a whole bunch of these helicopters sitting around, so often what they can sell are refurbishments of old helicopters as opposed to necessarily selling you new builds. That again brings the cost down and gives them a competitive advantage for buyers who aren't particularly picky on how recently their helicopter was made, but are very picky when it comes to sticker price. And it's these sort of aircraft, the Mi-8/17 series, and aircraft like the Sukhoi 30 Mk that appear time after time in the export registry of the Russian Federation. For Russia, this is where a lot of the money is. But almost as important as what you are selling is who out there is willing to buy it. Because, as I said earlier, when it comes to arms sales, security policy, diplomacy, and politics all go hand in hand with price and capability. Buying weapons from a country is a great way to improve relations with them. After all, you're strengthening their defense sector, underwriting their research and manufacturing efforts. Because of your decision to buy their stuff, that country is usually more capable of defending itself and also offering products to other buyers. At the same time, you're also signing yourself up to a sort of dependency. After all, a lot of weapon systems are going to be in service for decades. They'll require a supply of spare parts, software updates, support, and upkeep, all of which usually requires input from the selling nation. Even if you buy an aircraft from a country, for example, and you own that aircraft outright, you usually haven't purchased the right or the ability to update the software yourself. So when the avionics suite requires a software update to correct a vulnerability or performance flaw, you'd better still have a good relationship with the other country in order to get that update. If you suddenly fall out of relations with your main arms supplier, then you can be in a bit of a pickle. If you're Iran and the Islamic Revolution suddenly comes in and subtly adjusts international opinion and diplomacy, well then suddenly keeping the Iranian Airforce made up of imported American aircraft they sold to the Shah, well that becomes rather difficult rather quickly. And it's because of these factors that most competitions for weapon systems don't genuinely pit every potential competitor against others. Imagine, for example, if the Pakistani government put out a tender for a new light combat aircraft and the Indian government bid the Tejas. Somehow I don't think they'd make it to the detailed trial phase. Russia builds on the relationships that the old Soviet Union did. It offered an opportunity to maintain old Soviet systems, to upgrade them, and then eventually bargained those relationships into an opportunity to sell new, more modern Russian weapon systems. So I'm sure most of you can guess, but want to know for sure, who does Russia sell its weapons to? Because long gone are the days where you could just declare yourself communist and Moscow would shower you with freebies. They don't really do that anymore. Countries that bought from the Soviet Union on a large scale generally fell into four rough categories. You could be a Warsaw Pact or a communist bloc state. You could be a member of the non-aligned movement, so looking at you, India. You could be a country that may not be communist, but it opposed Western powers and couldn't buy from them, so went to buy from the Soviets instead. or you were a country on such a tight budget that Dassault or Lockheed Martin wouldn't even let you into the waiting room. Over the last 20 years, Russia's largest single client has been India. As India's economy has grown and its military has attempted to modernise, Russia has been the key arms supplier there to help it do so, leveraging the old relationship that India had with the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union was its primary weapons supplier. The second largest buyer was China, although that is starting to fade as the Chinese military-industrial complex gets up to speed, and there's also secondary clients in places like Algeria, Vietnam, and Egypt, all of which we will talk about later. Now, collectively, those countries represent the overwhelming majority of Russian arms exports over the last 2 decades, although they also sell to such fun characters as Myanmar and Bashar al-Assad's Syria. What isn't immediately apparent from the previous graph, but which is obvious when you look at these, is that Russia is actually the dominant arms supplier in Africa. Again, and I know I sound like a broken record, this is a role the Soviet Union once had, but which Russia reclaimed after a brief drop in the 1990s and early 2000s. Here, the big demand comes from renowned military powerhouse Algeria, followed by Egypt and Angola. In some of these countries, Russia verges on a monopoly supplier. Although I do want to stress that in this case, monopoly doesn't necessarily mean profitable. In 1996, the Russians had to write off about 70% of Angola's arms debts, mostly incurred buying weapons from the Soviet Union. And then in 2006, the Russians wrote off $5.6 billion worth of Algerian debt. And Algeria responded to this debt relief by immediately turning around and buying $7.5 billion worth of additional armaments. Now, to be honest, in some ways this reminds me of the old joke that the best way to hit a sales target is to go around selling $10 bills for $5 a pop. It's pretty easy to convince people to buy your weapons if you say that there's a decent chance you're going to cancel a debt later on. But in any case, this is definitely a part of Russian foreign policy. Just like sending Wagner Group into Africa, just like trying to secure political influence and resourcing contracts, arms sales into Africa are part of Russia's general strategy to establish influence over the region, even if that means accepting that buyers won't always pay their bills. And there's an interesting note here which sort of ties together the question of whether Russian products are any good and who they choose to sell to. Russian products are the way they are for a reason. The USSR developed very good SAM capabilities because it was shit scared of Strategic Air Command and NATO air forces. Now, in some, but not all cases, India doesn't fit into this category. But if you are a country which buys a large amount of weapons from Russia, there is a significant chance that you're on the list of countries that perhaps might be a little bit scared that eventually the US Navy or the US Air Force or another country using US technology, say an F-35 purchasing country, might eventually pay you a visit. In which case, Russian systems designed to counter that threat are exactly the kind of things that you happen to need. The Soviet Union designed weapon systems that could be maintained by a lower skill-based, largely conscript force. A lot of its customers, until modern times, did use relatively low skill-based and often conscripted forces. So in a sense, product and diplomacy tend to go hand in hand. The countries that want to buy from Russia also really require the sort of weapons that Russians design because they face similar sort of threats to the ones that Russia, and before them the Soviet Union, feared most. Portugal or Belgium probably don't feel a pressing need for S-400. Syria probably does. And it's worth keeping this sort of alignment in mind when we go through the rest of this presentation. Because now we need to start talking about recent trends, the years immediately leading up to the invasion and what they meant for the Russian arms export sector. Because it's hard to understand or project the influence of the war on the Russian armament sector if we don't understand the trajectory that the industry was already on. Because in a nutshell, the good times for the Russian arms industry started coming to an end in the second half of the 2010s. 2014 was a critical year. At that point, there are some restrictions put in place on imports of Western technology into Russia, though obviously nowhere near enough. But importantly, integration with the Ukrainian armament sector was cut off. Russian imports from Ukraine up to that point routinely ran into hundreds of millions of dollars per year for relatively critical inputs, everything from naval engines to rocket motors. And for some reason, Kyiv was no longer that keen to share after the Russians took Crimea and started a war in the Donbass. Then in 2016, Obama lifted the decades-long arms embargo on military sales to Vietnam, Vietnam being one of Russia's critical arms buyers. Suddenly, Russia faced competition in a market where up to that point it had faced basically none, And coupled with a general slowdown in the pace of military modernization in Vietnam, Russian arms sales to Vietnam cratered. The graph on the bottom right shows a pretty sad picture with a lot of Russia's major customers, a general downward trend with repeated and painful losses. France's entry into the Indian market in a very large way was particularly painful. When you look at this chart, which shows Russian arms exports in trend indicator value from 2012 to 2021, you don't have to be a top-tier business analyst to see the problem. Line go down. But you might be thinking that this is okay because at the same time defense spending in Russia at home was picking up. Surely that meant that the domestic industry was in relatively good shape, right? Maybe the state defense orders could actually augment and replace some of the lost export value. No, not really. A lot of enterprises in the Russian defense sector found the second half of the 2010s to be exceptionally difficult. In a 2021 report, the Congressional Research Service observed that the Russian armaments industry faced combined problems of outdated capital, that is, the industrial equipment they were using was generally old or imported, the workforce was largely aging and as a result suffering diminished productivity over time as individuals retired, low salaries made attracting replacement talent difficult, and many of the existing staff literally got their start during the Soviet days. The industry also faced a problem of high debt levels and very low profitability on domestic orders. What does that mean? It means that many in the industry didn't find supplying arms to the Russian armed forces to be particularly profitable. Now, a lot of inputs went into that. Obviously, there was corruption. Obviously, there was pressure to keep selling prices low when it came to domestic contracts and make up the money by selling to foreigners. And then there was an increase in prices for various inputs, particularly from overseas. But the main impact of all of that was that by 2019, Deputy Prime Minister Yuri Borisov concluded that the industry was living hand-to-mouth, and in 2020, Putin had to step in and write off a significant portion of the defense sector's collective debts. When coupled with the immense resources that had to be poured into replacing foreign and particularly Ukrainian inputs into Russian defense production, the Russian defense sector, while still obviously a global giant, wasn't exactly in the best shape before February of this year. And one thing you'll note listening to senior movers and shakers in the industry and other commentators is that often Russian industry was gambling or needed a major foreign anchor client for a particular weapon system in order to push it into production. In other words, when you look at something like the Su-35, there just wasn't enough money or demand in Russia from the Russian Air Force or the Russian MOD to complete development and make it cost-effective to put the thing into production. In order to actually make it a serial production aircraft, same with the Su-57, they would need a major foreign export order. And with none forthcoming, the industry was stagnating. And it was in that context to finally get to the point that the war happened. And war doesn't tolerate bullshit. It doesn't matter what you put on your technical specification sheet or what QA standards you claim for your manufacturing processes. Once you start sending weapon systems into combat, everyone's going to be watching to see how they perform in action. And Russia? Well, Russia did send its best. The results weren't pretty. And I want to stress when I say that I'm not necessarily talking about hard performance data. Hard performance data on a lot of Russian weapon systems is still very incomplete in relation to the Ukraine conflict, and like I said, will lag considerably the die down of the fighting. The Ukrainians likewise aren't in a mood to share, and that makes it very, very difficult for observers to pass the difference between the impact of training, doctrine, maintenance, logistics, and manufacturing from actual systems qualities when determining why something doesn't do or doesn't achieve what it was meant to. But even with that caveat in place, observers did notice some worrying QA issues and worrying performance issues when it came to Russian weapon systems in Ukraine. You famously had surface-to-air missiles being launched and then basically turning around and returning to sender on multiple occasions. You had the Ukrainians and Western observers reporting very, very high levels of failures for air-launched cruise missiles and other long-distance ordnance, coupled with some very public misses. And of course, you had video after video after video after video of Russian aircraft and tanks strewn across Ukrainian fields, being dragged away by tractors or molotoved by people by the side of the road after they had broken down or run out of fuel. Such outcomes are generally considered contrary to preferred system performance. And these images and reports leave potential buyers of Russian military hardware with a difficult question. They have to ask themselves why the hardware is not performing as intended. Is it, for example, something like a manufacturing issue, as it may be in the case of some of Russia's long-range missiles, which is something a buyer would be very, very concerned about when they decide whether or not they want to buy a system or not? Is it instead just an issue with maintenance or corruption practices? If Private Conscriptovich has stolen all the copper wire and that is why the tank doesn't work, or an officer put subpar tyres on a system, or no one exercised the vehicle for months and as a result it got immobilised, well, that's bad, but it's mostly a sign that the Russian army has bad practices. It's not a sign the system is terrible, and maybe if you buy it and give it a competent army, the system will perform better. Or again, maybe the systems were just employed badly. Maybe it was because the Russians ran their air defense systems forward in a mad rush to Kyiv, had them turned off and run out of fuel, and as a result they got murdered by TB2 drones, when systems like Book have no business at all being destroyed by drones. Book might still be a good system, but if it's used in an incompetent fashion, it can be made to look terrible. And if you're a buyer, it's very, very important what the correct answer to these questions is. But whatever the answer to that question is, there's another element here, and that's general reputation. And it's there that I think the impact of the war is less ambiguous. Because beyond hard performance data, general reputation of the quality of a particular weapon systems or a country of manufacture matters too. And for a variety of reasons. Troops don't want to climb into something that is famous for tossing its turret. Militaries in regimes that consider the military a source of prestige don't get to derive as much prestige if they're driving around weapons that are generally regarded to be inferior. If you live in a country which is a multi-party democracy, well then is the opposition going to be able to attack the government for buying a certain system? If, for example, the Ukraine war convinces the general public that Russian tanks are trash and death traps, and your government then goes and buys Russian tanks, well, it doesn't take much for the domestic opposition to turn around and saying, our soldiers deserve the best, our government does not value the lives of our soldiers, they need to buy quality hardware instead, and suddenly you're in a really tough position. And it's in this respect, I think, that several Russian systems are under significant pressure. As an example, we talked earlier about how air defense systems are meant to be an area of major Russian competitive advantage. This is an area where Russian systems are meant to be so good that countries will absorb being thrown out of NATO acquisition processes just to get their hands on a couple of S-400 batteries. And yet in Ukraine, these systems have had a number of embarrassing, meme-worthy failures. Whether it was the Buk missiles, so anti-aircraft missile launchers being destroyed by slow, underpowered drones in the early stages of the war, or the recent continuing attacks on air bases and arms depots, or just the phenomenon where sometimes Russian missiles seem determined to return to sender and boomerang right back towards the launcher, it's not exactly fantastic advertising. After one recent attack, there was a pro-Russian channel on Twitter that just simply tweeted, "What air defense doing?" and a meme was born. The meme spread across the internet until even members of the US Congress were using it. Now, it's worth noting at this juncture, to be clear, it's not just Russian air defense systems that have failures. There is a notable case, for example, of a Saudi Patriot missile suffering an embarrassing boomerang-style failure. And it's also true that Russian and Ukrainian air defenses have generally worked to keep the airspace above Ukraine contested, prevent deep strikes, and also now limit the use of larger drones on the front line itself. But every meme, every news story, every video that questions the effectiveness of these Russian air defense systems poses a real, if small, but genuine threat to future export options for Russian air defense equipment. And then there's the tanks, which have been launching their turrets all over Ukraine. Russian tanks are meant to have a reputation for being reliable, affordable, rugged, and battle-tested. Now, leaving aside the fact that I don't think the battle record for modern Russian tanks is actually that great, Russian tanks are now being battle-tested, and they're responding to that test by launching their turrets onto the second story of apartment buildings. Now, to be fair, there is a reason that Russian tanks do this, and it's not just because the designers were sadistic and placed no value on their crews' lives. Most Russian tanks use a carousel auto-loading system, with a carousel of ammunition stored directly under the turret and fed into the gun by an automatic loading system. Now, such a system does have advantages. You can remove a crew member because you don't need a loader. You can make the vehicle smaller and lighter with less internal volume because of that arrangement, and getting rid of a member of the crew. The problem is it means that if the vehicle's main cabin is hit and something ignites the ammunition in that carousel, the ammunition in the tank is going to cook off, instantly vaporize the crew, and launch the turret halfway into orbit. And that is how we get these dozens or hundreds of videos of Russian tanks throwing their turrets high into the air onto the second story of apartment buildings, hundreds of meters away from their tanks, and people just nonchalantly walking past the devastation later on. And this doesn't exactly make for good marketing. The Ukraine war has given us visual evidence of even the most modern Russian tanks, like T-90S, being knocked out. And at the same time, it is not hard for countries like the United States to turn around and point out that their tanks generally don't do the same thing. The crew of the M1 Abrams in that image on the top right are actually fine. The ammunition on that tank, which is, I think that's an Iraqi M1 Abrams, the ammunition is stored in a compartment in the turret behind a sealed door. On top of the ammunition compartment, there are blowout panels, which means when the ammunition ignites, the blowout panels blow out as the name suggests, and all of that explosive energy as the ammunition cooks off is directed up and outside of the tank, while the crew and the rest of the vehicle are unharmed. Now, I am not the person to come out and say that one tank is better than another. I think I'll leave that to the experts. But what I will say, from a marketing perspective, from a political perspective, is that the long lines of Russian destroyed vehicles and the turret tosses are likely to make it more difficult for politicians and militaries to publicly justify the purchase of Russian and Soviet-style armoured vehicles, when a Western or Republic of Korea competitor can turn around, point to their vehicle and say, but mine has blowout panels and an active protection system, and as a result is much less likely to kill the crew. Militaries already understood intellectually that the positioning of the ammunition on vehicles like T-72 and T-90 would result in this happening if hits happened in the right spots. What the Ukraine war has arguably done is make that reality undeniable, public, and visceral. But I think the greatest threat to Russian arms exports is actually the relatively poor performance of the Russian Air Force to date. As we covered before, the export of fixed-wing and rotary-winged aircraft is the most important part of Russian arms exports, and it's also critical to providing the funding and industrial support that will allow Russia to put next-generation systems like SU-35 or SU-57 into serial production. The problem is, and I would argue this is relatively objective, the Russian Air Force in Ukraine has not performed particularly well. Despite being monumentally larger and more modern and more expensive than its opponent, even now in late August of 2022, more than 6 months after the invasion started, and with a relatively limited amount of anti-aircraft equipment shipped in from the West, the airspace above Ukraine remains contested. Most Russian attacks deep into Ukrainian territory are with standoff munitions, and Russian helicopter and fixed-wing aircraft losses have been horrid. Flagship products like Ka-52 and Su-35 have been shot down, and we've also been treated to videos of Russian aircraft being forced to use commercial GPS systems and dumb bombs. We've seen the Russian helicopter force doing primarily pitch-up attacks using unguided rockets. We've seen Russian attack aviation struggling with moving targets and releasing extremely poor quality target designation and reconnaissance footage. It's just illustrated this idea that while the technical specifications, the performance characteristics of the Sukhoi or the Ka-52 might be particularly impressive, in combat these platforms have not performed particularly well, or at least they haven't impressed. When you compare this to what the world saw the US or NATO air forces do during Desert Storm, or Iraq II, or against ISIS, or over Syria, or over Libya, or over Afghanistan, or everywhere that Western air forces have intervened, this is not exactly a shock and awe performance. And some buyers might look at this and suggest that maybe, even though the aircraft are fast, maneuverable, and have good payload capabilities and performance characteristics, maybe the avionics and the onboard electronics or the doctrine and the training just aren't there to translate those physical platform capabilities into actual battlefield performance. And yet you might be asking, does any of this really matter? Does reputation really factor that heavily into purchasing decisions? I think the answer is it depends. But at the same time, reputation is more than just who wins post-wars on Reddit or Quora or whatever social media network you happen to be talking about. Like I said, that public perception factors into government decision-making, it gives oppositions material, it impacts military morale and military preferences. I think it would be premature to conclude how much damage these reputational factors will actually do. For one thing, some of the biggest critics, the ones who are consuming all of this media on the poor performance, are overwhelmingly in Western countries or places that wouldn't consume Russian hardware anywhere. If you are the Russian defense sector and you want to know whether or not these videos, images, or this narrative is going to damage your sector going forward, I'd actually be watching Indian media. I'll be watching Southeast Asian media. I'd be watching African media to see whether or not these stories of turret-tossing tanks or underperforming aircraft have made their way there. Because if the public in somewhere like India decide that made in India is probably better than made in Russia, then that's when the Russian arms sector is in genuine trouble. But if that's too ephemeral or uncertain for you, let's talk about what I think the real threats are. Because I don't think that the biggest threats are necessarily questions around the performance characteristics of Russian equipment or the reputation that it enjoys. I think it's the very real and practical implications of this war. Because what I've talked about so far are performance characteristics and reputation. So how valuable and useful is the equipment that you are buying, and how will the public perceive the decision to procure it? And that's well and good. But let me speak a language which is common to every procurement office around the world. Let's talk about risk, because whether a piece of Russian equipment is good value or not, or whether the public agrees with buying it or not, none of that matters if you try and purchase a piece of equipment and it never arrives because the Russians aren't able to produce it. And because of the nature of weapon systems, it's not just a problem if Russia can't produce it now. It's if Russia can't produce the constant supply of spare parts and technical support you need to maintain that weapon system into the future. And Ukraine threatens that supply. And it threatens it for three very distinct reasons. The first is Russian economic mobilization. The Duma recently adopted a law which basically allowed the Russian government additional powers when dealing with defense firms. In particular, it allowed the Russian government to compel defense firms to accept Russian state government orders. This would be an equivalent to the US deploying something like the Defense Production Act or other countries using their own equivalents. The idea is that during wartime, companies don't have the right to say, yeah, nah, I'd rather not do a defense contract. Imagine you are a British train-making company during World War II, for example, and you can make a lot of money manufacturing trains. But the government turns around and says, no, you're making tanks now. You don't want to make tanks, you want to make trains. You make more money making trains. But the government compels you to manufacture tanks, and for good reason. The country kind of needs tanks. In Russia, it's more a problem that countries might not want domestic orders because they have very low or even negative profit margins, and they might want to prioritize their foreign orders because that's where the real revenue comes in and where damage clauses can start to bite. But under this new law, there is a genuine chance the government says, no, you cannot export those tanks and you cannot prioritize the production of aircraft for the foreign demand. You have to meet our immediate replacement requirements. Or, as Ukraine has done, divert equipment that was intended for export for domestic use instead. If you are a foreign country looking to buy Russian hardware, you now have to accept the risk that now or at some point in the future, your order may be gazumped by the Russian MOD in order to meet the requirements of the Russian military fighting in Ukraine, and that might endanger your own national security. The next risk is that production quantities or quality might just go down because of sanctions. A lot of Russian hardware uses imported equipment still, despite their best efforts. There are reports that Iskander used American gyroscopes. Russian equipment captured or destroyed in Ukraine shows tremendous evidence of European and imported equipment and electronics particularly being used in their creation. Now, obviously, there will be some sanctions busting, and these companies did maintain stockpiles of foreign equipment before the war began. But there's a danger that eventually that will run out and that sanction busting cannot keep up with demand, and then where are you as a foreign buyer? If you have put your money up, you've committed your national security to a particular piece of Russian equipment, and Russia turns around and says, sorry, because of sanctions, we just can't build it, would you kindly wait 10 years? Then again, your security is in a compromised position. And heck, even if they switch over to a Russian replacement or substitute good, or they manage to bring in something from, say, China instead, well, then you ask if that impacts the performance characteristics or the performance of the weapon system or platform in general. Are you still getting what you were ostensibly paying for? There's a bunch of risks here, around quality, around timing, around non-delivery, all tied together with production. And even if you're not buying new, there's still risks. If you're buying refurbished equipment, well, what if the stockpiles of equipment are sent to the front or cannibalized in order to meet Russia's emergency needs? Or if your contract was reliant on components that were being brought in from other countries as well, is that contract going to be endangered? There are countries out there, for example, that have bought from both Russia and Ukraine. Are they worried that their contracts are going to be endangered? And that's if you're even able to buy the weapon systems and get them delivered at all. Because the sanctions against the Russian Federation are already unprecedented, and it's difficult to predict where they will go next. For example, even if it's okay to buy arms from Russia right now under the sanctions regime, will that change in the future? And if it does, will it cut you off from spare parts and technical support? If you rely on shipping goods from Russia, what will you do if additional shipping companies around the world refuse to service cargo from the Russian Federation? How will you handle payments? Russia's cut off from SWIFT, which means in a number of cases, it's already proven difficult for people to actually pay Russia. Are you going to barter with them? It's been done before, but it complicates doing business. What will you do if sanctions get even tougher in the future, and as a result, Russian production, even if it's sustainable right now, eventually falls over? Are you going to accept that part of your military is rendered neutered because you cannot get that supply of replacement parts or replacement platforms? My point is, it's no longer necessarily about how good the Russian systems are or how much they cost. It's about the risk that the war will prevent you getting them delivered to you in the first place or getting them maintained, whether that be because of sanctions, production difficulties, Russian reprioritization. The number of unknowns is massive, and most countries are not keen to gamble with their supply of major weapon systems, not when they're critical to their national security. And there might be a couple of case studies that really bring this home. Losing the Indian market is perhaps the greatest threat to Russia, at least in terms of raw dollar terms. And India is already moving away from Russian arms imports. India is both diversifying its suppliers, particularly looking at you, France. In 2021, France actually sold more value in terms of weapon systems to India than Russia did, for the first time in history. But India is also looking increasingly to domestic production, domestic tanks, domestic aircraft, domestic missile designs, in order to support its own security. And things like the purchase of the Rafale from France, these are more than just short-term wounds for the Russian arms export sector. They imply integration with Rafale-compliant and compatible weapon systems, for example. Rafale won't fire Russian missiles, so as long as that aircraft is in service, it's going to be missile systems that are integrated with Rafale. Plus, there will be a long sustainment tail of spare parts, software updates, etc., etc. So that loss, whether it's to France or the Indian domestic market, doesn't just mean a loss in 2021, it means damage that will take years to reverse if indeed it can be reversed at all. At the same time, India is a country with serious ambitions. This is a country of nearly 1.4 billion people. This is a great power military in the making. And you have to ask yourself whether or not India will risk its ambitions and its security with Russian arms when things like delivery and sustainment are increasingly subject to risk. India has already seen Russia announce delays to a large number of weapons deliveries, and you have to wonder if it will be willing to bet on weapon systems that may not perform or indeed never arrive. And then there are countries that are in a somewhat more difficult position. Vietnam, for example, historically purchases most of its major weapon systems from Russia. The problem that Vietnam now faces is that not only is Russia now a risky supplier of hardware, it doesn't really have China as an alternative supplier. Vietnam is a country with claims that clash with China's in the South China Sea, which means two dangerous outcomes are possible. It's possible that Beijing puts pressure on a Russia that is increasingly dependent on it to stop selling weapon systems to Vietnam, and that unlike other countries which might be able to turn to China as an alternative supplier of Russian-style or Soviet derivative systems, that China will not be willing to be a major supplier to Vietnam. Most countries generally don't like arming potential rivals. And so Vietnam is probably left in a situation where it would probably like to continue buying Russian hardware despite the additional risks involved, but politics makes it possible that they'll be facing threats to that plan going forward. And then there are a range of other countries that are also moving in the diversification direction, kind of like India. Indonesia is a good example. This is a country that was looking like it was going to buy Sukhois, now it's buying Rafale, and it's also agreed tentatively to buy F-15 from the United States. All of this suggests to me that there is genuine risk out there for the Russian arms export sector, and there are three potential beneficiaries out there: the Chinese, the Western arms exporters, particularly the French and the United States, and countries' own domestic arms industries in places like India, where the easy option of a Russian import is increasingly being problematized, which makes domestic options look relatively more attractive. And none of that is good news for Moscow. So, does all that doom and gloom mean the Russian arms industry is stuffed? Despite everything I've just said, I think the answer is actually a solid no, because there is a difference between the export market being threatened and overall demand for weapon systems being threatened. The Russian arms industry faces a perfect storm of threats: sanctions, inflation, reputational damage to its products. But it's kind of hard to go bankrupt selling weapons during a war. During peacetime, Russian industry was vulnerable because it was hard to get the money in order to maintain the production lines. The government was squeezing the industry for the best deal it could possibly get, and corruption was rotting it from the inside out. But money is unlikely to be a problem now. After all, if Russia was interested in making a profit or economic outcomes, it probably wouldn't have invaded Ukraine. The Russian military will require thousands of replacement vehicles, replacement cruise missiles. It will require literally millions of tons of ammunition in order to support the war effort and replace the stocks that are being actively depleted. The government has put in place rules that allow it to prevent employees taking leave and force overtime hours, at the same time as increasing unemployment is probably going to force more Russians into the arms factories in order to make a buck. As long as the money is there and the war goes on, I actually imagine production in a number of Russian armament sector is going to go up from peacetime levels, and we've already seen this in the missile sector, for example, where we've got evidence that some Russian factories are putting on hundreds of additional workers. But I do think there are questions about what the industry looks like on the other side of this war. Does the industry emerge from the war as basically a nationalised government arms workshop, or does it still maintain some semblance of corporate independence? Does the industry retain export potential and thus the ability to contribute to a hypothetical Russian economic recovery in the future? Can it continue to be a mechanism by which Russia pushes its influence into places like Africa and supports its trade balance and employment even as Europe transitions away from importing larger and larger amounts of Russian energy? Well, all of those things I think remain to be seen. The threat to the Russian armament sector isn't today or next week or next month. It's to those long-term export markets that are vital to maintaining its profitability and health and to its overall long-term potential. Only time will ultimately tell how much damage international sanctions, Western weapons in Ukraine, and snarky social media posts and negative news coverage can ultimately do to the Russian armament sector. But I would also say this: don't count the Russian defense sector or Russian armament exports out just yet. In 1991, the Soviet Union's armament sector completely imploded. Its supply chains were completely shattered. What were internal borders became international borders overnight. Resource allocations that were once based on workers being assigned and on the dedicated central planning and allocation of resources became market mechanisms basically overnight, and any sort of international clout or influence that the country had enjoyed suddenly vanished. Politically speaking, America was the victor of the Cold War, and countries had every political incentive to buy American, or at least to buy NATO. And we saw the result of all of this was that Russian armament exports a decade on from the fall of the Soviet Union were a quarter of what they had once been before the Union collapsed. And yet, despite having a fraction of the money and the resources backing the Western European and North American defense firms, despite often limited state defense budgets and crushing corruption that undermined research and development, production and procurement across the board, despite limited salaries which made it difficult to retain talent and caused many Russians with valuable skills to go abroad, despite aging material, aging capital and aging workforce, and a myriad and variety of other challenges beside, Russia rebuilt its position in the global arms market to once again be the second largest supplier in the world after the United States. It developed a number of very affordable and ostensibly very capable, almost unique systems that it could offer to the international market, and made a number of very high-profile and important sales. And Russia still has some good products. It still has good talent. It still has some good industrial capabilities. In Ukrainian hands, S-300 and Buk have performed well. Turkey, which is a nation which is actively supplying weapons to Ukraine, is going ahead with taking delivery of its second shipment of S-400 air defense systems from Russia in the midst of the current conflict, and the Pentagon is largely holding fire on criticizing Turkey for continuing to take deliveries under that contract. Now, yes, the Russians did put out a propaganda piece claiming that this was some new agreement and that Turkey was expanding its agreement. No, this is part of the original Turkish deal for the S-400, but the fact remains the deliveries are continuing. S-500, the Prometheus that Russia claims to have put into service, has on paper some very impressive performance characteristics which might make it attractive to certain countries. And even in a high sanctions environment, there may be countries for whom F-35 or perhaps J-20 are out of reach, and maybe they want to take a gamble on something like Su-75. And then there's Russian helicopters. Mi-8/17, it's still a cheap, rugged flying box. And there are so many militaries out there that want a cheap, rugged flying box. Flying boxes are useful, so are flying trucks. Just ask the B-52 and why it's still in service all these years on. So to go back to one of those first factors we discussed around a country's success in the international arms market, Russia still has some competitive, potentially world-beating products out here with which to compete in the market. It still has talented engineers, it still has companies that are capable of producing these weapon systems, some of which have had their reputations badly tarnished by the war in Ukraine, but others of which have largely survived intact. So yes, I think it would be a mistake to count the Russians out prematurely. I think a lot will come down to how the war in Ukraine ends, when it ends, and what the future sanctions regime looks like. If the war was to somehow end tomorrow, the sanctions were to be lifted, and Russia was to regain its place in the regular international community, then I think the Russian arms export sector might largely recover from what has happened. Some products would take a definitive hit and the industry would still be facing the challenges it was before the war began, but there would still be opportunities out there. Now, if the war continues and sanctions persist for some extended period of time, well then things become a little more challenging. So in conclusion, the USSR and Russia have long been major arms exporters. Russia has a strong presence in several export markets and is dominant in a number of equipment categories, particularly in the area of air defense. Even before the February invasion, though, the Russian armament sector had been facing a number of major challenges, a desperate need to recapitalize its equipment and its personnel, as well as very high debt levels. In that context, the damage that the Ukraine war has done to the reputation of Russian weapon systems may be a very significant problem. Although the extent to which that reputational damage is economically significant really comes down to the extent to which key Russian markets, so places like India and Vietnam, take up that narrative around the relative inferiority of Russian equipment. Perhaps much more damaging to the strength of the Russian defense sector is the damage to Russia's reputation as a responsible and reliable export partner. The combination of Russian domestic demand, economic mobilization, and international sanctions have made Russia a less reliable partner for weapons deliveries than it has been since the fall of the Soviet Union. And it's those factors, I think, which will weigh on countries that have to decide whether to buy more Russian hardware. Russian industry itself, meanwhile, is likely to survive or potentially even thrive in the short term. Under wartime conditions and in an economy with rising unemployment, it is likely there will be no shortage of government money, defense orders, and willing employees. The threat instead is to Russia's vital export position, and only time will tell how quickly potential competitors are able to jump on the opportunity presented. Alright, so channel update to close out. In terms of updates, the first thing to say is the video on China's military modernization, which was very economics and concepts heavy, received a bit of a mixed response. It had a fantastic like ratio, so clearly there's a core audience that liked it, but it didn't bite in terms of view count the way some other videos have. But the comments and the patron support was phenomenal, so I want to do more content like that in the future, but I also want to space it out. I want to make sure that I maintain a focus on Ukraine and also on topics that have been voted for by subscribers and by patrons. That means I do want to do a video on the global arms export market, for example, an extension of this one. I want to look not just at Russia, but the 9 other members of the top 10, what they sell, where their advantages are, and what the various dynamics around that are. So I guess what I'm saying is watch this space and continue to expect intermixed content into the future. I also want to say that a couple of more of my old videos have now gotten subtitles, and I'll be in contact with a few other volunteers this week. Basically, what I'm trying to do is onboard 1 or 2 volunteers per week and just get the team of people working on them expanding. I am so grateful for the offers that I am getting. I genuinely appreciate it. Once the subtitles are under control, we're going to start talking to translators. Final thing to say is that incredibly, the Patreon crossed 1,000 patrons, which frankly is phenomenal. Now, I don't want to be the sort of creator that stands here shilling my patron too hard, but I do want to express my genuine gratitude to those of you who have chosen to support me and my content. Producing military, industrial, and AusInt PowerPoints on the internet is not a mainstream activity, and having a solid base of patrons and subscribers gives me greater confidence to continue doing what I do. I'm giving some thought right now to what I can do in terms of celebrating this particular development. I'm also looking at starting a Discord, but like I said, badly timed because I'm traveling right this moment, so please just give me a week or 2 to get back into place, and then I'll look at those options. But seriously, again, thank you to all of you. Thank you to those of you who watched, those of you who like, who comment, who subscribe, and of course those of you who do support me on Patreon. It means the absolute world. Take care, everyone, and I'll see you again next week.